the company over to your brother, or I'll make sure you have nothing left to sign." My father said that to me on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, while my mother stirred her coffee and didn't look up once. I was 31 years old, 7 months pregnant, and I had driven 3 hours to tell them the good news in person. I should back up. My grandfather built Callaway Home Goods from nothing. Started in 1974 with a single storefront in Knoxville, Tennessee. Custom furniture, handmade cabinets, the kind of stuff that lasted longer than the marriages of the people who bought it. By the time I was born, there were 6 locations across the state. By the time I was in high school, my grandfather had quietly named me in his succession plan, not my father, not my brother, me, because I was the one who spent summers in the stockroom learning inventory, who sat beside him at trade shows asking questions, who actually cared. My brother never cared. He cared about being seen caring, which is different. When my grandfather passed away 3 years ago, he left the company in a trust, operational control to be transferred to me when I turned 32, provided I was actively involved in management, which I was. I had been VP of operations for 4 years. I knew every supplier, every lease agreement, every employee by name. The company was doing well. Not spectacular, but solid. My grandfather would have been pleased. What my grandfather did not anticipate, or maybe he did and thought the trust structure would protect against it, was that my father, who served as interim trustee, would spend those 3 years very quietly deciding the arrangement was unfair. To my brother Camden, who had never worked a day inside that company, who had borrowed $40,000 from my parents twice and paid back neither, who, at 34 years old, had just gotten out of his second failed business venture, a bar and grill in Nashville that lasted 14 months and was now apparently in need of a fresh start, at the company that was supposed to be mine. I didn't know any of this when I drove up to Knoxville in October. I thought I was going there to share that I was pregnant, that my husband James and I were expecting a girl in January, and that I wanted to start thinking about maternity leave coverage before the holidays. I thought we would eat dinner at the kitchen table, and my mother would cry a little, and my father would be awkward about it the way he always was with emotion. Instead, I walked into a meeting. Camden was already there. He was sitting at the dining room table with a folder in front of him and an expression I can only describe as rehearsed sympathy, the look of someone who has decided in advance to feel bad about something they are fully intending to do anyway. My father sat across from him. My mother stayed in the kitchen. "We need to talk about the company," my father said before I had even taken my coat off. I should have left then. I know that now. Something in the room felt wrong. Too still, the way air gets before a storm. But I sat down because they were my parents, and I had spent my entire life believing that sitting down and talking things through was what families did. My father explained that he had consulted with an attorney, that he had concerns about the trust structure, that he believed my grandfather had made the decision, under pressure, his word, and that the equitable thing, the family thing, would be to split operational control evenly between me and Camden going forward. I asked what he meant by under pressure. He said my grandfather had always favored me and that it had created an imbalance in the family. I said, "Dad, that's not a legal argument." He said, "It doesn't have to be." Camden looked at the folder. I looked at my mother through the kitchen doorway. She was still stirring her coffee. The spoon made a small sound against the ceramic over and over. She knew. She had known before I arrived. I told them I needed to speak with my own attorney before any conversation about restructuring the trust. I said it calmly. I was proud of how calm I was. I picked up my purse and I said I was going to use the restroom before the drive back, and I walked down the hall. I was coming out of the bathroom when my father appeared at the end of the hallway. He looked different than he had at the table. Something in his face had shifted. The performance of reasonableness was gone, and what was underneath it was something I didn't have a word for yet. "You're not going to fight this," he said. "It'll cost you more than it's worth, and you know it." I said I disagreed. He said, "You're pregnant. You're about to have a lot in your plate. Think about whether this is really how you want to spend that energy." I said, "Are you threatening me?" He said, "I'm being practical." I walked past him. I was halfway to the front door when my mother came out of the kitchen and said, quietly, the way she said everything, he's right, you know. Camden needs this more than you do. I stopped walking. I turned around. I've worked there for 6 years, I said. Camden has never worked there. Grandpa left it to me. She said your grandfather wasn't always right about everything. Then she said something else. She said it so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took me a moment to understand she had actually said it out loud. She said, once the baby comes, you won't have time for any of this anyway. Let it go. It would be easier if you just let it go. I want to be honest here about what happened next because I've replayed it enough times that I've lost count. I turned toward the door. My father was standing to my left near the staircase. I don't know if he moved toward me or if I stepped sideways or if it was some combination of both. What I know is that I felt his hand on my arm, hard, not guiding, gripping, and then I was falling. The stairs were 4 steps down to the landing. I caught the railing with one hand. I went down on my side, not my stomach. The railing held. I sat on the landing for a moment, and I didn't say anything. My father was at the top of the stairs. He was breathing fast. My mother was behind him, and she had her hand over her mouth. Camden appeared in the hallway. He looked at me. He looked at my father. He said, "What happened?" And his voice was strange, higher than usual. My father said, "She lost her footing." I put my hand on my stomach. The baby moved. I started counting. I got up. I walked out the front door. I got in my car and I drove to the nearest hospital, which was 12 minutes away, and I told the intake nurse that I was 7 months pregnant and had fallen down a flight of stairs and needed to be evaluated immediately. They took me back right away. The ER attending was a woman about my mother's age with reading glasses on a beaded chain. She was thorough and efficient, and she didn't ask questions until the baby's heartbeat was confirmed on the monitor, steady and clear, and then she asked me what happened. I told her the truth. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want to speak with someone from patient advocacy?" I said yes. I also asked for a copy of every piece of documentation from that visit, the intake form, the assessment, the fetal monitoring strip, the attending's notes, all of it. I asked for it in writing before I left the building. Here's something I want to explain, because it matters. I did not decide in the ER to do what I did next. I didn't have some dramatic moment of resolve. What I had was clarity, a cold, quiet clarity that felt less like courage and more like a simple recognition that I had run out of other options. My father had put his hands on me while I was pregnant. My mother had watched. My brother had asked what happened with the tone of someone who already knew. I called James from the hospital parking lot. This is the part that the people closest to me ask about most. Why didn't I call him immediately from the car before I even went to the hospital? The answer is, I needed to know the baby was okay first. I needed that information in my hands before I could say any other words out loud. If I had called James from the car not knowing, I would have fallen apart, and I couldn't afford to fall apart yet. When he answered, I said, "I need you to come to Knoxville. I'm okay. The baby's okay. But something happened and I need you here." He was in the car within 10 minutes. He drove 3 hours without stopping. While I waited, I called an attorney, not a family attorney. I called a civil litigation attorney in Knoxville whose name I had found 3 weeks earlier during one of those late-night research spirals when I had started, quietly, to worry that my father's concerns about the trust might not be theoretical. I had saved her number in my phone under dentist and told myself I was being paranoid. Her name was Miss Fairbanks. She answered on the 3rd ring, which felt like a sign. I told her everything in the order it happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Are you in a safe location right now?" I said I was. She said, "Good. Don't go back to that house. I mean that as legal advice." I filed a police report that evening. The officer who took my statement was patient and thorough. He asked whether there had been any prior incidents. I said no, not physical ones. He wrote everything down. He told me the case would be assigned to a detective and that I should expect a call within 48 hours. I stayed at a hotel near the hospital that night. James arrived at 11:30 and sat on the edge of the bed and held my hand and didn't say much, which was exactly right. My phone buzzed intermittently. My mother, a number I didn't recognize that I later found out was Camden calling from a work phone because he thought I'd blocked his cell. I didn't answer any of them. The next morning, Miss Fairbanks called. She had done preliminary research overnight. Here is what she had found. My father, as interim trustee, had over the preceding 18 months made 3 significant decisions about company assets that were arguably outside the scope of his trustee authority. One of those decisions involved a consulting contract, a very generous consulting contract, issued to Camden's failed Nashville Bar and Grill as a vendor partnership 6 months before it closed. The amount was $67,000. It had been run through the company's operational budget without board notification. He had also, according to documents Miss Fairbanks had requested, attempted to file an amendment to the trust structure with an attorney in Memphis, an attorney who was not the attorney who had drafted the original trust. That amendment had never been executed, but the attempt was documented. Miss Fairbanks said, "Your grandfather's original attorney still has the complete trust documents. I've already been in contact with his office. What your father was asking you to sign yesterday would have been legally invalid regardless, but the attempt to pressure you into signing, combined with what happened on those stairs, gives us considerably more to work with." I asked her what considerably more meant. She said, "It means we're not just defending the trust anymore. We're looking at potential charges." I want to tell you about Camden, because I think people assume the sibling is always the straightforward villain in stories like this. Camden is not a villain. Camden is a person who has spent his entire life being told he deserves things he hadn't earned, and he believed it, and that belief had made him weak in a way I don't think he fully understood. When everything came apart, he was the first one to crack. He called Miss Fairbanks's office directly, which he absolutely should not have done. 3 days after I filed the police report, he said he wanted to talk. He said he hadn't known our father was going to put his hands on me. He said he thought it was going to be a conversation. Miss Fairbanks called me after. She said, "He's scared." He also confirmed the sequence of events on the stairs in a way that contradicts your father's account. I said, "What does that mean for him?" She said, "That depends on how cooperative he is going forward." Camden was cooperative, fully, completely, self-preservingly cooperative. He provided a written statement. He produced text messages between himself and our father from the 6 weeks prior to my visit, messages in which my father had laid out the plan to pressure me into signing over control, had discussed what to say if I pushed back, and had said explicitly that if I wouldn't agree voluntarily, they would find other ways to make the situation untenable for me. He had not anticipated that my brother would hand over his phone. My father was charged with misdemeanor assault and elder financial abuse, the latter because 2 of the 3 trustee decisions he had made involved diverting funds from an estate that had been left, ultimately in part to protect my grandfather's legacy. The DA's office described it as a breach of fiduciary duty. Miss Fairbanks described it as the beginning of a process that would ultimately result in my father's removal as interim trustee and the appointment of an independent trustee to oversee the final transfer of company control. My mother was not charged. There was not enough to establish her direct involvement in the financial matters, and the prosecutor did not feel the physical incident gave them enough to bring a charge against her specifically. Miss Fairbanks said this was not uncommon. I sat with that for a while. My father's attorney argued that the incident on the stairs was an accident, that I had lost my footing, that my father had reached out to help me and the contact was mischaracterized. The hospital records said otherwise. The ER attending's notes said otherwise. The fetal monitoring documentation said otherwise. The text messages said otherwise. The assault charge was resolved through a plea of fine, anger management, 18 months probation. Not prison. I want to be honest that I felt many things about that, not all of them clean. But the civil case proceeded alongside the criminal matter, and by the time my daughter was 4 months old, the trust had been reviewed by a court-appointed independent trustee who determined that my grandfather's original intent was clear and legally sound, and that the attempted amendment was invalid. Operational control of Callaway Home Goods transferred to me on a Thursday in April. I was sitting in my kitchen when Miss Fairbanks called to confirm it. My daughter was asleep in the baby monitor on the counter. James was at the table doing something on his laptop. I heard him look up when I didn't say anything after I answered. Just listened, and when I put the phone down, he said, "Well?" I said, "It's done." He came around the table and put his arms around me from behind, and we stood there in the kitchen for a long time without saying anything. I still drive to Knoxville for work. I know every supplier, every lease agreement, every employee by name, exactly the same as I always did. The company is doing well, better than well, actually. We opened a 7th location last spring. My grandfather's original attorney attended the ribbon cutting and shook my hand and said something I've thought about many times since. He said he always knew you were the one who actually cared. I don't speak to my parents. That is a decision I made quietly and without drama, and I've found that the absence of them in my life takes up much less space than the presence of them did. Some people find that sad. I find it honest. My daughter's middle name is my grandfather's last name. She'll know who he was. She'll know what he built and why it mattered and what it took to keep it. I'll make sure of it. My grandfather used to say that the thing about good furniture is that it doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. The grain is the grain. The joints are the joints. Everything holds or it doesn't, and you know pretty quickly which one it is. I think about that a lot. I think about how long it took me to apply the same standard to people. My grandfather used to say that good furniture doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, not about furniture, but about people. About how long I spent looking at my family and seeing what I wanted them to be instead of what they actually were. The truth is, none of what happened was sudden. The signs were always there. My father's resentment that Grandpa chose me. My mother's habit of framing cruelty as practicality. Camden's willingness to accept things he hadn't earned without ever asking whether it was right. These weren't surprises that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October. They were conclusions to a story that had been building for years. I just hadn't let myself read to the end. What I've learned, what those stares taught me in the most visceral way possible, is that doing the right thing and the smart thing are not always the same, but when you're lucky, they line up. I didn't file that police report because I was angry. I filed it because it was accurate. I documented everything at the hospital because I had worked hard enough and long enough to know that evidence matters more than emotion in rooms where decisions get made. That wasn't bravery. That was clarity. And clarity, I've come to understand, is something you build deliberately over time. Through hard work, through paying attention, through refusing to let people rewrite reality for you even when they are people you love. Camden cracked because he had never built anything sturdy enough to stand on. My father's plan unraveled because it was constructed entirely on the assumption that I would be too tired, too pregnant, too conflict-averse to push back. He mistook my patience for weakness. That mistake cost him everything. There's a kind of justice in that. Not poetic, not spiritual, just structural. The choices people make have consequences that compound over time. My grandfather made choices that reflected his actual values. I made choices that reflected mine. My father made choices that reflected mine. And in the end, each of us ended up exactly where those choices pointed. I think about the version of me that might have signed the papers, that drove home from Knoxville and told herself it wasn't worth the fight. I understand her. She was exhausted. She was pregnant. She loved her parents even when they didn't deserve it. But she would have spent the rest of her life living inside a story that someone else wrote for her. And I don't think she would have ever fully forgiven herself for that. What carried me through wasn't rage. Rage burns out. What carried me through was something quieter. A bone-deep sense that I had done the work, that I knew what I knew, and that I was not going to let someone else's greed become my inheritance instead of my grandfather's legacy. My daughter is 7 months old now. She will grow up in a family where work means something, where honesty is not negotiable, and where the people who love you don't ask you to make yourself smaller so they can feel bigger. I intend to teach her, by example, that integrity is not a personality trait you're born with, it's a practice. That real intelligence means knowing when to trust your own judgment, even when the people closest to you are telling you you're wrong. and that the kind of persistence that actually matters is not dramatic or loud, it's just showing up again the next day and doing what needs to be done. She won't need to learn it from a fall, but she'll know the story. I'll make sure of it.